Hi, I'm Linda Hixon of the Hopedale Women's History Project, and I'm going to talk to you today about women and dress reform. This is the second part of a three-part presentation that I had planned to do in 2020 in time for the 100th anniversary of women getting the right to vote. This is about women's rights and women changing what they wear. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. And as grateful as I am to Hopedale Cable for doing this for me, I've got to tell you I miss the in-person presentations because I love the feedback. So I will have my website at the end of this presentation. So if you'd like to get a hold of me and give me some questions and I can give you some answers, or vice versa, you'll be able to do that. The Hopedale Women's History Project, I am the founder of that, and we are dedicated to finding and sharing the stories of Hopedale's women, and also of Hopedale itself, because it was an important town filled with important progressive people initially, and those stories need to be remembered and shared. So why dress reform? Why change what you wear? Why not wear what you want? Well, the first thing to think about is how conservative the United States was prior to the Civil War, and how volatile as the abolition movement was growing and cries for women's rights, and how Christian, and by that I mean Protestant, many denominations, all of them expecting people to live at a certain moral level. So I've got a couple of pictures here to show kind of a before and after. This is Lizzie. She was a relative of the Dutcher family. Found this picture in the Dorothy Dutcher collection at the Little Red Shop Museum. And she was from California. This photograph was probably taken after 1860, and I'm going to guess after 1870. And you can see how tight the bodice is on her outfit. And I mean, it's a beautiful outfit, but you can see how tight the bodice is. She is probably wearing a corset, and her skirt is quite puffed. Well, you can't get that by just gathering silk. You have to put in whalebone and stays and possibly even several layers of petticoats underneath in order to get that puff. Prior to this time, prior to the Civil War, actually during colonial times and around the time of the Revolutionary War, woman's dress, an average woman's dress, would weigh between 8 ounces and a pound, depending on the season. So not that heavy. A pair of man's cotton jeans weighs about a pound. So that's how much a winter dress might weigh. With some of the underlayment, maybe you'd be wearing 2 pounds of fabric. By this time frame, by the time Lizzie is wearing this dress, women's clothing is weighing anywhere from 7 to 10 pounds. Not just the dress, but all of the stuff she had to wear underneath the clothing. And that's a lot of weight. A gallon of milk weighs between 7 and 8 pounds. Imagine a couple of gallons of milk hanging off your shoulders or off your waist. That's a lot of weight to be carrying around. This next image is kind of an awesome cartoon of Princess Boncompagnie. She was Margaret Draper, the general's daughter, who married a prince and divorced a prince, and she became the it girl around Washington, D.C. This cartoon is from the late 1920s probably, and she's in her awesome flapper costume. Look at her. You can see her legs. This is only about 70 years later. So things would change hugely in that time frame. But the precursor to all of that is dress reform, is the change in dress. And it happens in part because of one woman, but not the woman we remember. The woman who kind of changed this whole long skirts dragging on the ground and the need for the hoops to hold up those skirts was a woman named Elizabeth Smith Miller. She was formerly Elizabeth Smith, the daughter of Gerrit Smith, who was a U.S. representative, a wealthy man. Garrett Smith, very progressive, knew the people of Hopedale. Elizabeth Smith marries a man named Miller, goes on her honeymoon around the world trip. She's rich. And she comes back from her trip with what's called the Turkish costume, which was a pair of trousers and a tunic. And she starts wearing this in her garden. And she tells this woman, Amelia Bloomer. Amelia was her cousin. And Amelia had a little newspaper that she had started after the 1848 Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention. And Elizabeth brought her costume back in 1850. And Amelia started her little paper, The Lily, and she and Elizabeth talked about this costume and how great it was. And Amelia writes about it in her newspaper. She doesn't push the costume. She doesn't say all women should wear it. All she does is say, this is not a bad thing, this costume. And she calls it a Turkish costume. But her name, Bloomer, stuck to the costume. And initially, and this happens in 1850, and by 1851, well, let's read what she wrote about in The Lily about the outfit. We would have the skirt riding down a little below the knee and not made quite so full as it is in the present fashion. Underneath the skirt, trousers made moderately full in mild weather, coming down to the ankle, not the instep, and there gathered with an elastic band. So puffy trousers. Or for winter or wet weather, the trousers not quite so full, but coming down to the boot, which would rise 3 or 4 inches above the ankle, so straight trousers. So you could wear it 2 different ways. Very modest. And the bloomers are all over the newspaper, the idea of bloomers, all over the newspapers by 1851. So this is spread pretty quickly from Amelia's little newspaper, The Lily. The Massachusetts Spy, a Worcester newspaper, quotes a letter that's unattributed in June of 1851 on several points. And people loved to make points back then and number them sometimes. The new style is far more convenient in walking than the old. The long flowing dresses strike against the feet and ankles every step a woman takes, thus helping, though unconsciously, to fatigue and exhaust the system. The bloomer dress is far more convenient for going up and down stairs and for getting in and out of carriages and railway cars. Now, I can speak to that myself personally because I remember being in a bridesmaid costume, a full-length dress, quite a full skirt, actually had a ruffle on the bottom, and you go up the stairs in that fast, and I think I was, about 16 at the time, running up and down the stairs with my sisters. And if you get caught, you're going down. You're going to fall. You're going to fall on your face in the stairs. Imagine going up the stairs in a full-length dress, carrying laundry in one arm and a baby in the other, and trying to hold your skirt up too. It wasn't convenient. It wasn't healthy. It could actually lead to injury. Injury not only of you, but of your children. So it was a good point. Her third point, the new costume has advantages in point of neatness and economy over the old. Hundreds of dresses in this city every week are sadly soiled and injured by being dragged and drabbled in the dust and mud of the streets. Well, she's right there. I remember the bell-bottoms that hung down to the ground and further in the 1970s, and you'd be wet up to your knees in a rainstorm. So the dresses got dirty, they got wet, they got ripped. Her fourth point, another argument in favor of its utilities, is that it's more favorable to health. When they were wearing the bloomer costume, they tended not to wear the corsets with it. They tended to let it be a little bit looser and more comfortable because most of the women who wore the bloomer costume were a little more progressive and didn't want to wear the corsets. Who has ever worn a long dress does not know how troublesome it is to perform housework in. Well, that makes sense. It all made sense. The Lowell American, Lowell, Massachusetts, noted for the 4th of July, probably 400 or 500 young ladies of the city were dressed in the bloomer costume on the 4th. Their appearance was generally very good. They attracted a great deal of notice from strangers who generally expressed themselves well pleased with their appearance. The mill girls in Lowell are also wearing the bloomer costume. They organized a Bloomer Institute, which met on Wednesday evenings for 1, the mutual improvement of literature, science, and morals, and 2, emancipation from the thraldom of the dictatorial French goddess fashion, and an exemplary enforcement of the rights and duty to dress according to the demands of nature. Women were supposed to dress a certain way. If you weren't wearing a corset, you were considered a loose woman. So this was a big change, and again, fairly positive initially. In the summer of 1851, Hopedale women are hearing about this fashion, and they hold a bloomer costume meeting in Milford. Abby Hills Price, who spoke at the 1850 National Women's Rights Convention in Worcester and will speak again at the 1851 Women's Rights Convention, which is coming up in the fall of 1851, again in Worcester. She's the president of the meeting, and she speaks about wearing the new costume. And Elmira Humphrey, who's absolutely adorable, and is shown here, is the secretary of the meeting. And she wrote about it for Aidan Ballew's newspaper, The Practical Christian. And she writes, there was no sneering, no affectation of wounded delicacy, but all seemed ready to give a dignified attention to whatever might be shown to be an improvement. This is about improving their lives. They talk about adopting the bloomers for the sake of their health. They want to adopt it quickly, and they want to be an example to others. Elmira writes that women had, quote, serious and important duties to do and has no business to envelope herself in useless drapery, which not only impedes her facility for labor, but which actually takes her both hands in many cases to take care of. The women had had enough of bodiced waists and whalebones, corsets, boning that they had to put in the skirts to make them puff. They've had enough of all that stiffness. They believe them to be injurious, and we repudiate them, together with long, heavy skirts, as moral evils. Remember, these are Christian, practical Christian women. The group decided to recommend and adopt the bloomer dress as more healthful, convenient, and becoming to those who would be useful members of society. For them, it's about work. It's more convenient, more comfortable to be working when you're wearing a shortened dress, shortened to the knee, and a pair of either puffy pants or straight trousers underneath. You can move around much more easily. A letter from Elizabeth Cady Stanton was also read. And she had known Abby Hills Price from the 1850 Women's Rights Convention. She may have even known her before, because Abby had been talking about abolitionist issues for quite a long time. Abby was quite popular on the abolitionist stage. But anyway, she knew it, and she was a supporter of the bloomers at first. She's going to change her mind, and she changes it very quickly. But in her book, she wrote a book called Remembrances about her life, and she said, in demanding a place in the world of work, the unfitness of her dress, women's dress, seems to some an insurmountable obstacle. How can you, it was stated, ever compete with man for equal place and pay, with garments of such frail fabrics and so cumbrously fashioned? And how can you ever hope to enjoy the same health and vigor with man, so long as the waist is pressed into the smallest compass, pounds of clothing hung on the hips, the limbs cramped with skirts, and high heels, the whole woman thrown out of her true equilibrium? I got to agree with her on that. Susan B. Anthony also wore the bloomer costume, and she wrote, what a liberty I felt in running up and down stairs with my hands free to carry whatever I would. Weirdly, that bloomer costume meeting makes national news. It shows up in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle on Saturday, August 2nd, 1851, and the Louisville Daily Courier on Thursday, August 7th, 1851. But even more weirdly, it shows up in the Liverpool Mercury, England Mercury, at the end of August in 1851. They don't say, because it's a tiny little article, and it's basically copied probably from the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, basically copied verbatim, almost completely. And they don't say where Milford is. They don't say it's Milford, Massachusetts, or Milford in America. They don't say that. This is a quote from it. The Practical Christian states that the ladies of Milford recently held a meeting to consider the propriety of adopting the new costume. Abby H. Price of Hopedale was chosen president, and Elmira B. Humphrey, who's adorable, secretary. After a full discussion on the subject, they unanimously adopted resolutions repudiating bodice waists and whalebones, together with long, heavy skirts as moral evils, favoring the adoption of the Camilla dress, and urging the present as the best time to aid a good cause by being the first to adopt it. Now, they call this article dress reform meeting. They do not call it bloomers. They call it the Camilla dress, which is something I hadn't heard before. My mother was British. She called underwear bloomers, so I assumed in England they had called them bloomers. Obviously, she wasn't alive back then, but it had been something that had been passed down through her family. But anyway, interesting that they called it the Camilla dress. Bloomers had arrived in England around the same time. There's an article in the Times in May of 1851, in the London News in July of 1851. The Times of September 15th notes some women in Green Park are wearing it, the peculiar dress so often described of late. And they give out handbills, and they talk to women about throwing off the yoke of their unfeeling and brutal oppressors and adopt an attire better suited to the dignity of the equal of man. In short, the pressure of the crowd became so great that the missionaries found it convenient to call a cab, which they entered amid much laughter mingled with cheering. So the women got basically chased out of Green Park. Abby Hills Price writes about the bloomers for William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator, also in September 1851. I believe woman has been physically injured by her dress. Long, heavy skirts connected with bodice waists have contributed largely to this injury. And now that fashion is for once on the side of physiology of convenience and utility. I hail it as an omen of the good time coming. Short skirts will greatly facilitate women's capabilities for different occupations, she being now almost of necessity confined by her dress to sedentary employments. I speak from experience. I find the new style decidedly advantageous as a working and walking dress. Abby did speak from experience. She was an abolitionist speaker, but she also worked in Hopedale. Everybody in Hopedale worked. They had to in order to survive. So she knew this. And it's all about being safe, walking in the stairs, taking your kids out for a walk, running around with your kids. In 1910, the Hopedale Sewing Circle put out a book called Hopedale Reminiscences, and Nellie Gifford, who was a child around this time in Hopedale, wrote about the bloomer costume showing up at church. This would have been Aidan Ballew's church, which is no longer existing in Hopedale. My first impression at church was vividly remembered. It seemed so queer to see dignified women appear in bloomer dresses, some made with quite snug-fitting pants, others full and gathered at the ankle. So she remembered this from her childhood. And William Draper, General Draper, also noted bloomers in his book Recollections of a Varied Career. In the 50s, there was a movement for reform on women's dress, which consisted of the adoption of a costume designed first worn by Mrs. Amelia Bloomer. He remembered her name. That's awesome. Corsets were abandoned. Skirts were shortened to the knee and supported from the shoulder, kind of like braces, what my mother used to call braces, hanging down from your shoulder to hold your skirts up, while trousers similar to those worn by men, if I remember right, completed the costume. As Hopedale was in the front rank in the adoption of real or alleged reforms, several of the ladies temporarily adopted this dress and were regarded as great curiosities when they went outside the Dale. My mother's mother paid us a visit before she had seen or heard of this innovation, and one day, in looking out of the window, she saw a dress reformer coming down the street. She called my mother and pointed in the direction of the apparition and said, "Hannah, what is that?" My mother replied, "That is what we call a bloomer." "Is that all?" said my good grandmother. "I thought it might be the devil." So I'm not sure William Draper was a proponent of the bloomer costume. His grandmother was Anna Mowry Thwing, and his mother Hannah Thwing Draper, the wife of George Draper. So they talk about it, though. In the future, they will talk about this little dress reform movement. Abby Hills Price wore a bloomer costume when she went to that 1851 Women's Rights Convention at Brindley Hall in Worcester. The Boston Semi-Weekly Advertiser wrote about it after the convention. They say, Mrs. Price of Hopedale read a report on the Industrial Associations of Women, in which the subjects of employment, wages, etc. were handled. Her remarks were not very complimentary to the so-called nobler sex. She was in favor of all offices in the state government being open to women, and also of their being admitted to the pulpit, bar, and bench. One of the first obstacles to be removed was the present style of dress. Mrs. Price advocated a change here by her own example, she appearing in a very handsome bloomer. But within less than a year after being up on stage in her bloomer, she gave up. Things had gone badly very quickly. I liked the dress, she wrote in the Practical Christian late August 1852, and would still do all I could to favor its adoption, but I doubt the wisdom of wearing it at all times and on all occasions. I can see the effect that it has upon other minds, and this consideration makes me timid and afraid to venture further than I can win my way and give my reasons, and assure myself of confidence and respect for the thing. I have felt brave in wearing it, hoping thus to recommend it to others. I no longer feel this hope. Consequently, I am weak. Let those who are strong act according to their own conviction. I shall enjoy the dress at home about my business. I shall advocate for its adoption as the best dress in all respects. But when I go out into the world, I shall conform. Breaks my heart to read that. Abby was a strong woman, and for her to give up, things had gone badly. From what I've read, the mood turned quickly on these women. These women were seen as agitators, and they would be insulted, they would be abused, they would have rocks thrown at them. Boys would pick up dog feces and throw it at them. Their health for the dress actually became endangered by wearing the dress, by the crowds, by the rabble that didn't understand. Elizabeth Cady Stanton also gave up on the costume. The press at once turned its guns on the bloomers. A lot of what I saw was positive early on, but quickly it turned badly. She wore them for only 2 years. The tyranny of custom, she said, that to escape constant observation, criticism, ridicule, persecution, mobs, one after another gladly went back to the old slavery and sacrificed freedom to repose. The clergy in New York started attacking the bloomers, and Amelia Bloomer fought back in the Lily. She used the Bible as her guide. She said no commandment ordered a woman, or Eve, to, quote, swathe and cripple herself in long, tight, heavy, draggling skirts, while Adam dons the more comfortable, healthy, bifurcated garment, a pair of pants. God clothed them just alike and made no signs that henceforth they should be distinguished by their apparel. Years later, Amelia actually wrote about why people gave it up. We all felt that the dress was drawing attention from what we thought of to be of far greater importance, the question of women's rights, to better education, to a wider field of employment, to better remuneration for her labor, and to the ballot for the protection of her rights. In the minds of some people, the short dress and women's rights were inseparably connected. With us, the dress was but an incident, and we were not willing to sacrifice greater questions to it. I think the bigger picture was that. I think the smaller picture was that people didn't want to get hurt by mobs for wearing this thing. Male opposition to the dress grew. A correspondent from the New York Herald doesn't give a year, but he said, we saw in broad daylight in a public hall in the city of New York a gathering of unsexed women. Unsexed in mind, all of them, and many in habiliments in what they were wearing, publicly propounding the doctrine that they should be allowed to step out of their appropriate sphere and mingle in the busy walks of everyday life, to the neglect of those duties which both human and divine law have assigned to them. We do not stoop to argue against so ridiculous a set of ideas. Hopedale women didn't give up the bloomer completely. They're writing about it in 1853 in something called the Inductive Harbinger, which was a handwritten newspaper. The bloomer costume was then discussed, and the result of the debating was that both sides, for and against, seemed to like their own opinions best. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? 1854, they can see the demise coming on the horizon, but Harriet Newell Green, who's working publishing newspapers and working at a press, keeps wearing it. She started publishing newspapers in 1858, so she's wearing it for quite a long time. The Hopedale Sewing Circle, which writes about a lot of progressive ideas. They don't actually write about dress reform per se, at least not until April of 1861, which is around the time that the Civil War started. We had some conversation on the subject of dress, on the propriety of dressing plain in order to find more time and money to spend in other directions. So they're not talking about bloomers. They're talking about not being quite so frilly like that early picture of Lizzie in her absolutely gorgeous dress. They don't want to be that frilly. These are practical Christian women. They want to dress plain. July 1862, which is not long before the record ends, in the middle of the Civil War. As a matter of fact, things are going badly for the North at this point. They write about changes coming. Those present enjoyed a social conversation on the dress of ladies in general and of the utility of corsets and skirt supporters in particular. The former was decided useless by the majority present, the latter necessary. Corsets will become tighter, stiffer, more common as the decades go on, but bloomers will reemerge later as the fight for civil rights heats up after the Civil War. There's an 1874 meeting on dress reform held in Boston, just like the early dress reform meetings. And bicycles. When the bicycle is invented, women can't ride a bicycle in a long skirt. So the bloomer reemerges as this new healthful uniform for wearing when you exercise. But even that in the 1880s will be a problem for some 1880s and 90s. The Minneapolis Tribune, 1894, wrote about Mrs. Meta Boardman of New York, who wore a bifurcated skirt while riding her bike. Her costume started a sensation, partly because Mrs. Boardman was described as a very plump woman who looked like a fat boy who was dressed with blessed with neat ankles and feet. And that description seems to indicate she was wearing trousers. Others would follow her example, but many rode at night just to keep from getting lambasted for wearing these costumes. And in Boston, Mrs. Hattie Fowler and Miss Christine Brown used divided skirts and trousers, and the newspaper quoted them as braving the eyes of all Boston. The skirt split halfway to the knee. Miss Brown wore long, baggy pants like Turkish soldiers. This caused, quote, a ripple of consternation to roll across the city. How sad is that? That after all this fighting in the 1850s, women give it up, but then they're able to go back to it by the 1890s. So some of these women would have still been alive at that point in time. And you end up with something like this from 1929. This is the Herbert Hoover committee meeting with Fanny Osgood right there in the center in her stripy dress, with women in their awesome hats, in their great attire with their knees showing. Thank you for joining me for Our Own Worst Enemy, 3 generations of women fight for women's rights, dress reform. Thanks to the Hopedale Cultural Council and the Massachusetts Cultural Council for supporting this event. Many of the images you've seen came from the Library of Congress. Their website has awesome information in history. Thank you to Bancroft Memorial Library and the Little Red Shop Museum for sharing their images. I'm Linda Hixon of the Hopedale Women's History Project. You can get more information at hopedalewomen.org. Thank you for joining me. Take care.